Hello. Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started. Sorry for the late start here. For those of you who've been waiting, if it's a sign maybe of things to come, this group won't keep their mouths shut. So I'm Milan Vaishnav. I'm a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment. Nice to see so many friends here this afternoon. I want to welcome all of you and welcome our special guests who are in the first row, who you'll be hearing from in a short while. We're here to commemorate the launch of a new book, this very brightly colored tome, Rethinking Public Institutions in India, which was just published by Oxford University Press. I had the good fortune of serving as one of the co-editors along with my colleagues Devesh Kapoor and Pratap Bhanu Mehta. The origins of this particular book actually date back to an earlier book that Devesh and Pratap co-edited in 2005 called Public Institutions in India. That book, much like this one, tries to understand the nature of the Indian state amid, the sort of sweeping changes that are taking place in the Indian landscape in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economics, politically, and in terms of its sort of the social change we've seen, especially in the last quarter century or so. In 2013, Devesh, Pratap, and I had a conversation when we first sort of met to discuss this idea of maybe we should revisit some of the themes in this book, sort of a decade on. Partly, I think, as a reaction to the intensifying churn that was taking place in India. So, the growth of civil society, the shift brought on by liberalization, which reduced the state's role in production but increased its regulatory role, a more decentralized politics in which states came to the fore in terms of sort of day-to-day governance, which reduced the powers that New Delhi had once prized. So this book is not merely an updating, it's a brand new book with all new contributions, and it brings together some of the leading experts in India or who work on India to evaluate the state of governance as it stands today. Each chapter is an examination of a different core federal institution, ranging from Parliament to the Supreme Court to the Election Commission of India, the Reserve Bank of India. If the book imparts any wisdom at all, I think my co-editors will agree, it's really a testament not to us, but to the various authors who've contributed their expertise and time to really dig deep in each one of these institutions. And although they're not here today, I want to recognize them all publicly. Very quickly, the book tries to understand four types or four clusters of institutions. Institutions of oversight and restraint. So this is the sort of premier institutions, the executive, the parliament, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Economic institutions, namely the Reserve Bank of India, and the different expenditure organizations like the Finance Commission, the erstwhile Planning Commission, and regulatory institutions. The third cluster are the accountability institutions, so things like the Comptroller and Auditor General, the Central Bureau of Investigation, Central Vigilance Commission. These have gained, I think, in prominence and notoriety in recent years. And last but not least, the institutions that deal with implementation, so the civil services, the Election Commission, and the local government institutions, which have come up since the passage of the 73rd and 74th Amendments in the 1990s. Each chapter is guided by sort of three central questions. How does the institution in question manage human capital? How do they staff, recruit, nurture talent? What are the internal organizational features, particular to that institution, that motivate or do not motivate good performance? And last but not least, how does this institution interact with other institutions, right? I mean, all of these are kind of embedded in a broader institutional context. And I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but I think, the analysis that's in the book throws up a lot of paradoxes. I'll just mention a couple. One is that, the Indian state is highly understaffed in personnel terms, at the same time that it's highly over-bureaucratized in procedural terms. It can manage large, complex tasks like holding an election for 850 million people, conducting, a mammoth census, launching a mission to Mars, while it struggles to do seemingly mundane things like deliver basic health, education, water, sanitation. It continues to be saddled by colonial-era institutions at a time when the old colonial master has revamped its own institutions probably several times over. So I think each of these paradoxes we'll touch upon in the discussion to come. But needless to say, I think there's a lot to chew on in this book. So the way things will work is I'll invite first Pratap and then Devesh to give a few remarks on different aspects of the book, and then invite Joel and Maitri to join us and have a bit of a conversation and back and forth, and then we'll end with audience Q&A. And I hope all of you can stay after this event. We'll move downstairs and we'll have books for sale, book signing, a little reception. So please do try to stay for that. Let me just say a word about my fellow panelists, starting with Pratap, who really needs no introduction, but he is the president and CEO of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. I'm sure most people in this room read his writing regularly in the Indian Express. One can say without any exaggeration that Pratap is today India's foremost, I think, public intellectual. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. I also have to embarrass him a little bit because last week the news came out that Pratap has just been named as the new Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University. So if you'll join me in congratulating him. Which is a huge and very important distinction. Next is Devesh Kapoor, who's the director of CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania, and a professor of political science. He is the author, editor of not one, not two, but 3 books in the last 12 months. Some of you may have been here in December when Devesh came to talk about his book on Indian Americans called The Other 1%. Maitri Abordia Das is the global lead for social inclusion at the World Bank. She was previously a member of the Indian Administrative Service, so is going to speak about this institution both as an insider as well as somebody who studied from the outside. I just want to make a plug for a recent report that she co-authored with her colleagues at the World Bank on the interesting outlier of Himachal Pradesh, a state in northern India, called Scaling the Heights, Social Inclusion and Sustainable Development in Himachal Pradesh. One of the things the book doesn't really do is delve into Indian states. So if you want to learn more about that, please do read her work. Last but not least, we have Joel Hellman, who's the Dean of the Walsh School of Foreign Service down the road at Georgetown University, and the distinguished professor in the practice of development. He joined SFS after a 15-year career at the World Bank, most recently as the bank's chief institutional economist. He served in a number of important countries, not least India, where he was the governance manager, but going to rely on Joel, I think, to bring some international comparative context to the discussion today. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Pratap.
Good evening. It's a great privilege to be here. And thank you, most of all, Milan, for occasionally embarrassing all of us, but also being such a force of nature in India studies now. What I'll do in the next 3 or 4 minutes is just try and talk a little bit about the broad kind of context of social changes in the last 8 to 10 years against which the study of institutions is set. As Milan mentioned, we did a book more than a decade ago, Public Institutions in India, and when we were thinking about sort of rethinking public institutions, one of the questions we had in our mind was, okay, so what's changed about India broadly? Apart from, in a sense, you know, the issues of internal design and recruitment and so forth that Milan talked about. And broadly, I think it's fair to say that if one looked at, let's say, the period, you know, maybe 2000 to 2013, 2014, let's say 2014, kind of the election of the Modi government as a kind of marker, there was a sense that Indian institutions are now going to be embedded in a polity and society which is clamoring for a change in the direction of our institutions along certain dimensions. And I'll just very quickly sort of list them out. The first and most important, perhaps, was a change from a culture of institutional secrecy to a culture of institutional transparency, which has huge ramifications for how institutions actually function. The Right to Information Act was, that in itself was kind of one, as it were, element of that general direction that institutions now have to operate in a context of greater transparency. But it's not just the Right to Information Act. In fact, the asymmetries of information between state and civil society, many people thought were actually being redressed in favor of civil society, so that many years ago the state did not tell you that something was happening, nobody told you that, you know, something was happening. So what did it mean for institutions to function in a context where both normatively and sociologically there's this kind of great push towards a state founded on relative secrecy to a state that's actually trying to institutionalize a regime of transparency and what's the politics around it? The second big change that happened sort of around this time, which is related to the first, was that all states, in a sense, exercise a great deal of discretionary power. And one of the things the chapters do a lot of is trying to kind of understand what is the balance between sort of rules and discretion in design of institutions, right? But partly as a result of civil society movements, anti-corruption movements, there was a big clamor to say, okay, yes, the state can exercise discretion, and you obviously can't replace the state with robots. So in that sense, there will always be discretionary power vested in the state. But what are the forms of public reasoning and accountability that are appropriate to the exercise of discretionary power? And if you think of, for example, economic governance, allocation of land, minerals, natural resources, all those kinds of things around which state exercise discretionary power, there was a sense that they need to be governed by new norms now, not just sort of, as it were, rules. So that was, again, the second normative direction with a sort of sociological kind of movement behind it. The third big debate was about centralization and decentralization, which of course is still an ongoing one. And I think one of the interesting challenges is, while arguably there has been a bit more fiscal and administrative decentralization, we are now entering a new era of political centralization. And one of the, I think, interesting questions is, what is the dialectical relationship between political centralization, administrative centralization, financial centralization? They don't always, as it were, go in the same direction. So, that was in a sense the third sort of big kind of, direction of social change. The fourth, which we don't touch upon in the book, but I think it is worth thinking about at this moment, was that in a sense, the book came out just at the moment where that grand era of coalition politics in India came to an end. And I think, although we were conscious of it, I don't think it's reflected as much in the book. This interesting question of to what extent does the broader fragmentation of power in the kind of political system affect the functioning of institutions? And I think as one, if one might say a little bit controversially, but if one thinks of the kind of this moment in global democracy, I think one of the interesting challenges is going to be is to what extent are the so-called autonomous institutions of the state, the courts, for example, one very prominent institution, going to be able to withstand the greater centralization of political power that you're actually going to sort of witness. I mean, Indian democracy has done remarkably well in some respects over the last 6 decades. But I think we are entering a moment where I think the relationship between concentrated electoral power and the functioning of institutions is, in a sense, going to be, sort of tested, tested again in very sort of severe ways. So, these broad changes, in a sense, I think to my mind, both, in a sense, captured in part what was a kind of clamor from kind of civil society over the last decade or so, but also signaled a certain kind of normative direction that institutions actually needed to take in terms of how they conceive their own role in society and the forms of accountability that they are actually going to be subject to. And in part, the book, sort of institution by institution, sort of tries to see, how much down this path Indian institutions have gone. As the story of Indian democracy, as we know, barely the first chapter has been written. I leave it to Devesh to sort of talk about a couple of the other issues in the book.
Thank you all for being here. What I'll do is to raise a few questions that we think are important for how effective public institutions are, but which we were not able to address in this book, and hopefully that'll provide us with some food for thought in our discussions. One is a core question of how personnel are selected into public institutions. Are you getting the right person for the right job? And in the Indian case, actually, the constitution was very forward-looking. It created a constitutional body called UPSC, the Union Public Service Commission, which conducts all the exams for the civil services, etc. But we actually have no good way of evaluating whether the type of exams that they do is appropriate for the types of jobs for which people are being recruited for. So if you recruit someone for the Indian Forest Service, the exam actually able to tell this guy actually love nature or not. He might love nature because you can cut the wood and sell the wood, but does he actually care for nature, right? That's the sort of thing we don't know how these exams really, are they selecting for the right variables? Second thing, which is a big gap in this book, we don't at all have any coverage of the security institutions, military, the paramilitary, and the police. The single largest increase in personnel of the Indian state in the last decade has been actually for the paramilitary forces. Exactly what that means, what is happening, all of that, we actually don't cover that. Third is, in India, as sort of Milind had raised, the actual implementation of public programs is at the state level. The center designs policies, comes up with the funds, but the implementation is at the state level. And as we know about India, the Indian state, it is relatively better at policy formulation. It's not very good at implementation. And the implementation is done by state level agencies. And that is something, again, it's not covered in the book. We are looking at only federal institutions, not subnational institutions. And you could argue that's really where the rubber hits the road when it comes to implementation. Fourth, I think, thing is which Pratap raised is the relationship of public institutions with society at large. I mean, one of the things about the Indian state now, it is much more socially representative of society than in the past. To that extent, it's more embedded in society, which you could argue is a sort of a good thing. But what that also means is that the autonomy of the state from society, which also matters for effectiveness, might be lost. So there is always this tension between sort of embeddedness and autonomy of the state, and how that balance is changing and what its implications might be are something which we don't really engage very fully. And so relatedly, Pratap and I just had a volume on higher education in India, and that story is not a very happy story. And of course, when you think of all the people who inhabit the state, what is the sort of cognitive processes in their training in the earlier years before they join that really shapes their worldviews when they join the government service? Last is, and I think Joel will sort of address this, what are the yardsticks that we use to judge an effectiveness of a state? So when we say the Indian state is not performing, or what's the yardstick? One yardstick is, well, relative to India's per capita income, how are other states doing at that level of income? So India's income, as some of you know now, is what the US had 100 years ago, roughly, around the end of World War I. The American state in whatever 1916, 1917 was, had quite a few weaknesses. And so you could say, well, it's not a big deal. That's what you expect. Lower incomes means weaker institutions. What's the big deal here? Second sort of yardstick is about expectations. You say, look, unless it performs better, it's not the Indian society, the economy, that engine will begin to sputter. So it's about your expectations rather than perhaps what might be the yardstick of that level of income which gives certain outcomes, which we may not find to be adequate enough relative to the challenges at hand. And hopefully we'll have discussed these sort of issues later. Thank you.
So, are you? It's difficult to do this in a sorry. Maitreya, I think I'll start with you, because as I mentioned in the introduction, you have an interesting insider-outsider duality, having been a member of the IIS and now at the World Bank, looking at things from a different perspective. What's your general assessment? I mean, when we think about the Indian state, people's attention generally turns first to the Indian Civil Service. And when we turn to the Indian Civil Service, you turn to the IAS, which is the kind of elite apex of the Indian state, the Indian bureaucracy. What's your assessment of where it is and how it's changing? Because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's obviously not immune to changes that have been going around in India more generally over the past, since independence.
Right. So, I mean, the IAS has been the subject of a lot of hand-wringing amongst people saying that, this is one of the institutions that has done the worst and has gone speedily downhill. And I have to say, I don't agree with that at all. One of the things that I see, if you look at the long-term trend of where the IAS was at independence and now, one of the biggest changes has been the change in the social background of IAS officers. So it's much more representative as an institution. So people in the IAS today are far more representative of society than previously. So it used to be this westernized elite that came from certain castes, from certain regions, and today it is a far more representative institution. What that also means is that people who are now in the IAS are much closer in social background to politicians. And they are much closer with their nose to the ground, have a much better sense of what people need on the ground. So I actually do think that that's one big change that took place. And those changes took place as sort of, you say that, there aren't any one stroke of the pen reforms, but in fact, there were one stroke of the pen reforms that took place in the recruitment system. So the English essay was abolished in 1979. What that meant was that it led to a whole lot of people that came from the sciences that were not as conversant in writing English, but for work from the IITs that came in. It created a whole new diversity. There was always reservation, but in 1995, Mandal brought in much greater reservation of people from all kinds of different backgrounds. So today, you have, then there was you could write the exam in languages other than English. What that meant was that the preeminence of English as something that made the IAS as an elite service removed from reality, or so people claimed, removed from the ground, actually that changed. And so I think that that's been probably one of the biggest changes that has taken place in the IAS, which can to a large extent explain the manner in which the IAS today interacts with politicians, with people, but our yardstick for measuring whether or not the IAS is doing well still remains the same as it was in 1947. So if you look at the IAS conduct rules, the All India Service Conduct Rules, and it tells you what the officer-like qualities are, those officer-like qualities for someone who comes from a small village and someone who comes from an elite, UP Brahmin family would be very different. But we still stick to something that was put in place way back in the 40s and 50s.
So you spoke about a democratization of the service, which has had all sorts of ramifications for the composition, the conduct, and so on and so forth. One area where we haven't seen a lot of progress, and we were discussing this before, is when it comes to gender.
Yeah.
That women are still highly underrepresented
Absolutely.
in the service relative to the population. Why is that, and what does that mean? What are the implications of that?
So, I can only speculate. Women have never been more than 13 to 15% of the IAS strength, ever. And that hasn't changed over time. Now, why that is the case, if you look at, you give it a broader sociological explanation, coming from a more feminist background, you would say, well, the society that you want to create is much more diverse in terms of caste and tribe and region, but not more diverse in terms of gender. So that's the broad sort of idea of a state that really doesn't think women are equal. But why else that's the case? It's really actually very difficult to say. So do less women apply? Yes. Do less women compete? Yes. But once they are in the system and once they do compete, they actually do as well as men. And once they're in once they're in the service, they actually do not do as well as men. And so the kinds of jobs that women tend to get in the IAS are very different from the kinds of jobs that men get. And there are all kinds of stories, not stories, but actually facts. So women being so-called superseded, which is that when they are due for certain promotions to the highest levels, they in fact don't get those promotions. And so, yes, I think that's been, if you look at the long-term trend, it is in some way symptomatic of the kind of society we want to build.
The numbers you cited, 13 to 15%, if you look at Parliament, for instance, you also see similar underrepresentation, right?
Exactly.
You look at other parts of Indian society. So it's not specific necessarily to the civil service.
But surprising. So I'm very surprised that this hasn't changed in the IAS. I'm not surprised that it hasn't changed in other parts of it. Because this is a competitive service. So the people who are competing are already very highly educated people. They're already highly driven people. So what is it that prevents women from competing? And the answers are not, oh, it's family pressure, etc. That's all. It's something about the perception that female candidates have of a labor market that they feel may discriminate against them, that then prevents them. And it happens in so many other places as well. Women just won't compete because of what they think may happen. And there aren't really a whole lot of role models that they can look up to. And those that are look like they're complete outliers.
So let me ask you one more thing, and then I want to bring Joel in, which is about the nature of the talent pool. So many people have argued, and it comes up in the book as well, that what you really need to do to build a 21st century state, given the complexity of the economy, of you need to have somebody who's a food inspector, who's a securities regulator, who works on atomic science, who all of the rest, that you need to bring in outside talent. So there's this question of lateral entry. So picking the best and the brightest from civil society, from academia, from the private sector, and finding a way to bring them into government, which is fairly common in the United States, for instance, right? I mean, you have this idea of political appointees, and they that's used to bring in those sorts of backgrounds. But this is not something this particular government has been very keen to push on, or at least a lot of people have been underwhelmed with what they've done. Is it a priority, and what are the pros and cons? Because many people in the civil service obviously aren't huge fans of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of government, there has been much less of a representation of so-called technocrats from the outside entering into the fray. And that kind of begs the question, a generalist civil service or a specialist civil service? And the civil service, by definition, was a generalist civil service, okay? But the government, by definition, is not a generalist government. So the state is not a generalist state. The state has pockets of specialization in it, which together make for a system of governance. Now, whether or not, so lateral entrance, I think lateral entrants have been in government way back from the 1980s on, and sometimes more, sometimes less. They've always been the case. There have been ways in which governments and ministers have circumvented rules. So there's this idea of an officer on special duty, okay? When you're unable to bring in someone in a position, you're unable to create a position that is a lateral position for whatever reason, and there are many reasons for that, you bring in someone on a temporary basis as a consultant as an officer on special duty. And there have been there have been instances of ministers with front offices full of young Kennedy School graduates, basically running a front office of a minister, and all of them have been officers on special duty. So I think that the Indian state is not always the way it seems. There are many ways in which things happen by stealth. There are many ways in which the state can be circumvented, both at the local level as well as the central level, and that happens. Then that's not clearly visible to the eye. What is visible to the eye is the person that you can see, which is probably the IAS officer or the minister. So I think that lateral entry as a position or as a policy probably has not moved fast enough or hasn't moved effectively enough. But does that mean that there hasn't been much more of a lateral entrance by stealth? I don't think so. The other thing, and I'm going to stop here, the other way in which expertise comes into government is through specialized committees. So you find specialized committees that have historically been headed by, have been headed by people who are well known in the field. They may not be non-Indians, and a lot of people feel very strongly about the fact that, well, there are a lot of people who are outside of India who should go back and who should be invited back. I'm not so sure it's such a, that's sort of more of a self-serving argument. But I think that there are many ways in which the state brings in talent from the outside in advisory capacity, if not in specific roles and positions.
Joel, I want to bring you in because you've spent a lot of time in India, but you've also spent a lot of time not in India, in the former Soviet states, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and of course, in various positions at the bank, looking at things more comparatively. We talk in this book about the fact that India's institutions haven't kept up with other changes that have happened, whether it's the economy, society, politics, and so on and so forth. But we often don't stop to think about how India compares, relative to others, and that's sort of the question that Devesh left off, ended his remarks on. How do you see this question of kind of, governance in India circa 2017?
That's a big question. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased to be here with this panel. When I got the invitation, in addition to wanting to join a panel with former friends and colleagues from Harvard and the World Bank, I always take up the opportunity to read and think more seriously about India's public service delivery and public institutions. And there have been a series of great studies, a lot of edited volumes over the course of time on that. And the reason why I do is because, and as the editors themselves say in the introduction, we know extraordinarily little about the process of state building and development. It is always something that I find absolutely remarkable as a trained political scientist, as someone who was supposed to be in a discipline that thinks about politics and states and the performance of states. What is sort of shocking is how little we really know about how states are created, how states develop, and the factors that lead states to develop, state performance, and essentially the creation of functioning state institutions. Really nuts and bolts. We used to have, when we were going to graduate school, you could focus, as a political scientist, you could focus on comparative politics, international relations, political theory, or the last one, and it was always the last one, was public administration. And nobody did that, as far as I recall. And I don't think you can anymore, in that I don't think there is such a thing as a concentration in any modern political science department in public administration anymore. There's some, last remaining schools of public administration. The Kennedy School is a school of public administration in name only. It does many, many wonderful things, but not as much in the nuts and bolts of public administration. And the reason why I say that I'm always drawn to books on India is because from my vantage point, from a comparative vantage point in development, what's striking about India are, in fact, the organizational depth, complexity, coherence, and capacity of India's public institutions relative to others at their level of the economic development, or relative, I wouldn't even sort of put it in, in per capita GDP terms, but just relative to most other countries around the world, or certainly developing countries around the world. And I'm always drawn to India because I want to understand how and why that happened, and how that has been maintained over time. There's always a simplistic explanation. It's the colonial legacy. It's the coherence that the British brought to the system. But obviously, that's far from the case. It has to do, obviously, with the level of India's democratic development, India's openness, the complexity of India's politics. But if you just look at the quality of India's public institutions, there's just very, very little comparison. Now, I spend most of my time in the World Bank looking at failing and conflict-affected states. And I always use India as a benchmark because I always thought that getting those states to understand how India's institutions develop would be a more realistic mechanism for them to understand the development of public institutions. Sending them and thinking about IAS training, for example, was something that most countries around the world could only dream of having. The depth and coherence of public sector training that India has. you have standout institutions obviously at the center that are truly world class, that one could put against any country in the world. So that's what draws me to an understanding of India. And so I get the book, 500 pages of it, and I really delve into it because I actually think it's in the details that you really want to understand it. But what strikes me is the remarkable kind of pessimism of the editors. The last line, I have to sort of say, is, you're talking about as India's challenge mount, the need for institutional reform is vital, if not necessary. It is not a matter of choice, but of survival.
I think Devesh probably wrote that line.
So, I mean, give yourselves a break, India. No, I think Land Pritchard, and you refer to it many times in the book. He did, in his very clever and inimitable way, put out that kind of image of a flailing state, which I found sort of extraordinarily attractive. And what does he mean by a flailing state? The brain and the center thing's extraordinarily coherent. It's the limbs are just going around in an almost incoherent way. So its ability to implement anything that comes from this strong core and high capacity center is limited, which is not terribly surprising in a country of the size, scope, and complexity and diversity and democratic competition as India. Perhaps the other thing I'd say is that I come from a perspective. Everyone brings their own personal perspective into anything they do. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s. If you think about the quality of American urban infrastructure and public institutions, as late as the 70s and early 80s, extraordinarily nepotistic, extremely high levels of patronage. Corruption was endemic in American urban public institutions for most of the 20th century. And you're talking about, in the book, solutions to India's public sector institutions problems related to things like, well, what about new public sector management sort of tools, right? How do you rid the bureaucracy of political interference, which in light of the last couple of days in this country is still, a significant problem. I mean,
although I'm glad you used New York and not Washington D.C. as your.
But the point being that countries at far higher levels of wealth and kind of longer term of institutional development are still struggling with many of the same problems. I know the dimensionality and the depth may be much greater in India than that. But I don't necessarily see those as existential for India's public sector institutions. I continue to question how did India build the strength that it has? How is it not facing problems that so many others are facing? You also talk about the book about this lamentable issue of India not having enough civil servants. For those of us who are going to work in the World Bank, I mean, find another country that has a problem of too few civil servants. Almost every country has the opposite, right? It always uses the public sector for patronage and nepotism reasons and always overhires, and the problem is always trying to get control over the public sector. On the quality of education that goes into the public sector, again, I don't think there's any comparison. The new forms of accountability that are being brought into public institutions in India, although they're obviously at very nascent stages, and you recognize that in the book, still extraordinary and transformational sort of shifts that the democratic system and accountability are bringing on those institutions. And finally, and you raise this in the commentary, but the decentralization of authority and power at going all the way down to the Panchayat Raj level. That's also having a kind of remarkable and transformative effect in public institutions and what that means. So I come from to India's public institutions probably from perhaps a very, very different lens. I recognize the problems that they have and the challenges they have to face in order to continue to play as a constructive role in India's rapid development. But they seem to me actually quite ordinary problems of public sectors in a lot of other much more developed and wealthier states. And actually, again, for India's level development, I find there's much to learn and much to engage in from the story of India's public.
So, Arvind Subramaniam, who's the chief economic advisor to the government of India, very well known in this city, has this really lovely chart that he's fond of using, which looks at, the relationship between sort of inclusiveness and per capita income, right? There's this big literature now popularized by Acemoglu and Robinson, Why Nations Fail, and Fukuyama and many others. It sort of broadly is saying, there's this relationship that if you have inclusiveness, inclusive institutions, there's a generally positive relationship with per capita income. And Irvin points out that there's two big outliers there, India and China, right? India is very inclusive, doesn't have a very high per capita income. China is very exclusive, but it has a very high per capita income. Many people would say, well, the reason for that is because of India's weak state, right? You don't have a state apparatus that's able to really deliver, and so therefore you have this disjuncture between robust democratic accountability on the one hand, but low per capita income because you're missing the sort of thing in the middle, which is the kind of quality of whether it's law, whether it's civil service, whether it's basic social service delivery. I mean, how would you sort of respond to that kind of argument?
Well, I think what it does go to show is that we still really don't have an understanding of what the impact of institutions are on performance overall, right? So, if we again think about where our thinking about political politics and institutions are going, the institutional wave is all the rage, right? It's all about, well, let's think about the quality of institutions being the kind of the fundamental factor that drives performance. Why Nations Fail is talking about it at the low end of development, and I think Arvind's talking about it, across the board. And I still think that is a relationship that we don't still really fully understand. Like what's the causal impact of institutions in shaping economic outcomes? Right? So I think that kind of is part of the reason that sort of leads to kind of deep questions as to why sort of China's public sector institutions, which look very different in India's public sector institutions, what impact they might have on performance. But again, I also suggest, I think that what Devesh put on the table earlier is again measuring what yardstick we are using to measure the relationship between institutions and outcomes. Right? So what are institutions trying to achieve? What is their performance? Is it stability? Is it creating, the framework for democratic competition in a stable environment? Is it maximizing growth and the potential and opportunities for growth? There are, many possible outcomes that we think of for institutions, and I don't have a kind of clear linear story about whether India's inclusive institutions impact those outcomes in a predictable way.
Pratap, I'd like to bring you in here because, one of the constant themes of your writings over the course of many years has been on the relative inattention by political actors in India to the infirmities of the Indian state. And I guess I would just ask, given what Joel has said, is that, well, maybe things aren't as bad. Maybe there is no deep institutional malaise. Why do we care so much about this?
So you might be surprised. I actually agree with a lot of what Joel says.
I am surprised.
In the sense that, so two things, right? One is, I think, what do we, in a sense, know about state formation and development more generally? I think other than saying that the world is kind of thick with causality in all kinds of different directions, I think the era where you could actually say, here's the theory that explains it all. Is it institutions? Is it social capital? I think it's more important to, in a sense, focus on mechanisms rather than kind of the single theory. Having said that, let me just explain, I think, why there's a reason to worry, and which is, I think, compatible with Joel's kind of broader account, which is that if you look at certain raw characteristics, India stands out. And obviously, the underlying premise of a book like this is, it is a functioning democracy, it is a functioning society. So it's, there must be something going on that actually, in a sense, enables that to happen. But I think what comes out of the different chapters very clearly, I think, is something that I think should give us a little bit of pause. And it also goes to Joel's remark about the United States, right? Which is one that institutions, it turns out, are very fragile things. And by that we mean specifically the idea that there is a notion out there in the literature, right? That if you simply design institutions and get design elements right, you will be a good way to solving problems, right? I think one of the conclusions of the book is sobering, that actually design helps, but I think we have to ask the question, under what conditions do those designs features work, and do they help? I mean, like, there's only one good social science question: under what conditions, right? But the reason to worry, and that goes to Joel's question about why this question about crisis and survival and all of that is I think the following. There are lots of accumulated small bottlenecks to the way our institutions function that can, over time, if they're not addressed, have huge political ramifications, right? So if you just think of this particular moment in our democracies, the United States and India, right? One thing they have in common, I think, is there seems to be, or there was a moment of a certain kind of impatience with, let's say, for example, legislative gridlock, right? Where legislatures became the epitome of gridlock, of plutocracy, of special interest, right? I mean, there's a commonality to that discourse, right? And at one level, you can, look at this question when it's raised about legislatures and say, oh yeah, but there's still functioning legislatures, there's still functioning democracies, there's still a lot going on in these legislatures. Yet, if these problems are not addressed, you could actually create the seeds of the destruction of those very institutions, right? And so I think the language about anxiety and survival is not so much a kind of a description of a fact, as it were, that this is, in a sense, about to happen. It is really to say that, look, there is certainly, I think, in our democracies, and the last Indian election was actually, I think, a good sort of, an indication of that fact, that it is possible that, given the kind of institutional life we have, there may be actually a certain kind of impatience with the way in which institutions are functioning that could create the very conditions in which actually the legitimacy of these institutions erodes to a point, right? What happens if the Supreme Court orders are not obeyed by governments tomorrow, right? Real possibility, right? So in that sense, I think the language of crisis and survival is not that, the Indian state has not done certain things well, and, and so forth, but it is really to focus our attention on, a stitch in time saves 9 kind of I think a challenge. And frankly, at this moment in our democracy, we have to take that challenge very, very seriously.
A lot of people, Devesh, say, you go on and on about institutions, but if you look at the 2000s, when India had, record, right, the fastest growth, it did that in spite of its institutional foundations, right? And so if this current government is able to, again, get back to 8, 9, perhaps double-digit growth, are these institutional questions actually that central? Because they seem to be delivering a lot, even though, we have a lot of criticism to offer.
I think, it's been raised again, well, everyone used to talk about corruption in China and India, right? The World Bank talk a lot about corruption in China and India, and they were the fastest growing countries, So people say, well, what's the big deal about corruption? I think one of the things is to think about this in a longer horizon, rather than the present and the next few years. One thing is, we know that for most countries, high rates of growth do not persist for long periods of time. There are very few countries that have has sustained, 3 decades of high growth rates. It's only a handful of countries. For most, you have spurts, and then you have institutional bottlenecks and things run aground. So there is that issue. I think going back to Joel's point about yardstick, I think for me, and maybe that's why I ended on that pessimistic note, Joel, is in a sense someone you and I sort of worked with, when we were in Harvard, was Sam Huntington's, original sort of opus on political order. It's about expectations. India has an incredible youth bulge. The sorts of processes and other high growth episodes in the past, high growth led to massive, employment, movement out from agriculture into non-agriculture. That's not happening. And you could argue in the 21st century that will not happen. Technology, whatever. Now, that's when I think having weak or strong institutions might matter much more. Are they able to manage, in a sense, higher levels of political disorder if these very high aspirations, expectations of a very large youth that has credentials, but really not that many actual skills for the modern labor market. You need a whole set of functioning institutions, essentially to manage this, right? To work things out. And they become the battleground, actually, rather than managing. They become the battleground of these expectations and aspirations.
So, if I can just jump in there, I think this is the point at which we probably need to dwell on what this book doesn't do. So the fact that it looks at the macro level federal institutions is, and essentially makes prognostications based on that, I think is the flaw in it. So is one of them. Okay, I think that a lot of what goes on in India happens at the local level. A lot of the innovation takes place at the local level, and I'm just wondering whether we are putting too much of an onus on these large public institutions for the delivery of a number of different outcomes. So is there an implicit bias of attribution that we have, which says that it's because of these institutions that certain things are happening or not happening, when in fact there is a whole host of other unobservables that are happening on the ground? I mean, and this is, I'm not even talking about the stealth with which certain things happen within these institutions, where the law or the rules say one thing, but in fact something else is happening, and it happens both for the positive and for the negative. But in fact, there are things that are happening outside of these institutions, both through state level and local level institutions, but also outside of public institutions. And not just the non-government organizations, and not just the panchayats. And actually, I think that Raghu's chapter on decentralization is actually a fairly good depiction of where decentralization is. I think the piece that he doesn't talk about, which is a really important piece, which again brings me to the part of who's left out in all of this, is the Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which is the Schedule 5 areas, which is the tribal areas in India. But that's a separate issue. I think that there are a lot of local level initiatives, a lot of self-help stuff that's going on and has always historically gone on So the role of public institutions, I think, is extremely salient and extremely significant, but that's not all that's leading to outcomes, good or bad.
Yeah, go ahead, please. With that.
No, sorry, quickly. I think you're absolutely right, Mehta. In fact, one of the things we actually kind of say explicitly, which is that there's no attempt in the book to, in a sense, attribute outcomes. I mean, the outcomes form a kind of general backdrop, as it were. In fact, I think one of the big challenges is how do you actually attribute those outcomes, I think, as Joel suggested. But let me push you a little bit on this, while kind of, I think, agreeing with the general thrust of your remarks, which is, I think both the selection bias in terms of what we focus on as examples of successful outcomes, and the kinds of institutions we then sort of say explain those outcomes. So at one level, I think that's going to be an inevitable feature of, in a sense, any kind of project, right? I mean, but I am not as, I mean, I'm a big votary of decentralization for institutional and normative reasons. But I worry that I think a lot of the success we attribute to that and the kind of resilience of Indian society, NGOs and all of that, also is built on a kind of selection bias of its own kind. So if you look at the big problems that India is going to face going ahead, right? So a lot of the focus was on kind of, delivery of special things. That's how, because those are easy to measure, right? Education, some health, drinking water, public services. But the fact of the matter is, India probably has the most polluted water, most poisonous air in the world, right? It still has a massive public health crisis. Climate change, all of that stuff kind of coming on. I'm not sure, I mean, and I think this is an open question, which is I'm not sure that models of decentralization and models of, in a sense, civil society engagement, right, which were designed around, in a sense, addressing specific needs, deliver this service, deliver that service, are actually, in a sense, fitted to manage these kinds of complex challenges, right? And I do think, to that extent, I think this kind of move that we took, right? Look, the opposite, we did that with states and markets, right? When states don't function, maybe market is the solution. When central states doesn't function, decentralization is the solution. I do think it is time that we'll actually have to sort of break out of that, in a sense, I think a little bit.
So?
Yeah, when you think about the kinds of complex challenges that you put on the table, and the recognition that the outcomes as a result of those challenges really do require some, significant engagement performance on the institutional front to deal with them, and they do have sort of serious consequences for overall long-term development. What strikes me and what I was looking for in the book is that when you write a book about public sector institutions and you talk about institutions, the tendency is to think that there is something in the functioning or in the structure, the organizational coherence of those institutions that are leading to its inability to tackle those complex challenges. So you look at this institution, you look at the civil service, you look at the RBI, you look at and you sort of say, what's wrong with the way in which this institution functions or the way in which the institution is organized? But I'm not fully convinced that it's actually something within the structure, organization, design, capacity of the institution itself. What I hear and what I read about when you actually talk about it in case by case is that there is something in the political arena that shapes what institutions can and can't do. Right? There's a political intervention and a political engagement. There's a political background. There's an ethnic and levels of engagement that impacts the way institutions are structured, that impacts the way institutions sort of function. So it's not really about the organizational design itself. It's something more deeply rooted in the political process. And so my tendency to think is that when you think about the challenges that you laid on the table, I wonder to what extent is it the institutional design that's going to deal with this, but what are the underlying political roots of the dysfunction that you're talking about? And when you started describing what you saw as the biggest risks because of these bottlenecks and others that are leading to a delegitimization of institutions, I thought you were talking about the United States. I mean,
Absolutely.
I mean, in other words, the inability of getting things done, the inability of getting to agreement. I mean, look at the functioning of of our legislature here. Gives the Lok Sabha a run for its money in terms of coherence. So there is something about the way in which democratic systems are handling these complex challenges that I'm not sure that the underlying variable that's sort of critical here is something in the structure of institutional functioning as it is something about the nature of the democratic competition and how it sort of shapes the mediating role of institutions.
So, please.
So, I mean, which is none of what I say is meant to be overly sanguine about the whole. I agree. I mean, the challenges are vast, and I don't agree on the doomsday scenario, but I do agree that the challenges are one thing that has permeated or mediated the relationship of institutions with politics, with people, with outcomes, has been the structure of center-state relations and the manner in which regional parties have asserted state control and state priorities to the detriment of public institutions. And now, have state-level institutions stepped in to fill that void or to sort of bridge that tension? Yes and no. Not enough that outcomes on the ground would change. Not enough that health or education would improve. And there's several times in the book you say that the whole tension between who is responsible for policy making in health versus implementation in health, or who is responsible, or the ways in which fiscal flows are determined to a very large extent affects the manner in which outcomes actually are good or bad. So I think that this tension between the IAS is a classic example of the manner in which states and regional parties have actually asserted their control over an institution that by definition had dual control. And the dual control had a preeminence by the federal or the central government, but over time the state government has asserted its control over it. And that to a large extent has led to the manner in which IAS officers have tended to identify with their state level masters as opposed to their central level masters. So
let me just end with Devesh, because then we'll get some questions from others. Since you've been now labeled Mr. Doomsday, so if you think about the current political moment, post Uttar Pradesh, a betting person would say that Prime Minister Modi is likely to get a second term. A lot can happen, but if current trends continue, the start of a second term and a strong position in the lower house would be matched for the first time by a strong position in the upper house, which the current government and its allies lack. And that this could lead to, there's sort of three doors. The first door is personalism, kind of closing of space, and a kind of over-centralization of power. The second is the kind of, muddling through. And the third is that actually this political power gets used to fix some of these larger questions on institutions that have often not been adequately addressed because you've had political fragmentation. Which door are we going to see?
What's your sense?
I asked you.
The first.
The first.
Undoubtedly, in my mind.
Can you elaborate on that?
Huh?
Can you elaborate on that?
I think all the tendencies, are headed in that direction. This is not, one has seen very few signs of a government that has used its power to strengthen institutions. It has used its power to try and better implement programs, projects, which it has, highways, solving problems. That's very different from strengthening institutions. Because almost always when you strengthen institutions, they become a check on power. In some ways, the institutional design into democracies is about checks and balances. I certainly do not see, at least in my reading of this government, that there is a deep desire for strengthening those checks and balances. And you could well get better outcomes in a sense of better project implementation, right?
More investments, more
Yeah.
bank accounts.
Yeah. So you could get a lot of that. There is no reason to, lots of countries that are not very democratic have done well. We have this myth in political science, which we repeat, democracy is the best things is sliced bread, etc., etc. The Koreas and Taiwans and all, they did pretty well, in those circumstances. So, I mean, if you want to separate outcomes from institutions, you could get both. You could get much better outcomes and much weaker institutions.
Okay, there's a lot there, but I want to refrain and bring in other voices. So we have some microphones going around. I just ask, as usual, please identify yourself, keep your questions short, and we'll try to take as many as possible and end a little bit after 5:30 since we started late. This gentleman here in the first front row.
Good afternoon. My name is Prasad Kadambi. I'm a consultant in nuclear safety, and I'd like to know what this panel has to say in your study of public institutions in India about the Department of Atomic Energy, and where does it stand relative to the other public institutions, and where do you see it going?
Okay, we'll take another question right here at the end.
Hello, Tunir Mukherjee with American University. Thank you so much for your discussion and thoughts about Indian public institutions. I actually have a few questions. I'll be quick about them. First of all, you've seen sometimes personalities kind of take the spotlight instead of the public institutions. Vinod Rai for the CAG and Raghuram Rajan with RBI being one of the examples. Is that good for public institutions going into the future, or would it be better for public institutions to have their leaders more under the radar and do their work subtly? And secondly, you see a rule of law and public institutions being strengthened in Latin America, and the Organization of American States doing a lot of work with that ideology going forward, and you saw that with corruption scandals breaking out in Brazil and Mexico. Do you think India being in the position where it is in Central Asia, Middle East, in China and South Asia lacks such an organization or coherent interchange between countries around the region, where actually India stands out of the example in the region rather than drawing from examples? We talk about America and the West, but India being where it is actually in a precarious position. And the final question is the public institution of Lokpal, which dominated the headlines for the best part of the beginning of the 2010s, has actually vanished from the sphere and nothing has moved on from that. Is that a public institution that will end up happening, or was that all a farce that was coming out of the corruption scandals? Thank you.
Okay, you cheated a bit there, but I will confess complete and total ignorance about India's atomic, and we should have Ashley tell us. I shall give you his email.
Exactly.
You can write him. But do you want to?
No, just that, look, the Department of Atomic Energy historically has always reported directly to the Prime Minister's office. It is not something that is the most transparent office. It has always had a dual thing, nuclear energy and the nuclear weapons program. And for those reasons, It cannot be very transparent. That's about as much as I know.
Personalities. So Vinod Rai, who was the CNAG who really brought that accountability institution to the fore, Raghuram Rajan, T.N. Session, who was
Right.
a landmark chief election commissioner. Pratap, good thing or bad thing?
So I think the way to think about it is, what are they using their power for, right? Is it to strengthen an institutional norm, or is it in a sense to aggrandize themselves? I think that's really the question. So I think the test is, did they put in place processes, procedures, whatever, that under reasonable circumstances, I mean, unless there's a political cataclysm and so forth, you would look back and say they actually left the institution better off. I think, unfortunately, it turns out in most of the cases it's not an either-or question. Sometimes there are these moments where when an institution is being politically challenged for all kinds of social forces, political forces outside, actually strong leadership matters. In fact, one of the surprising conclusions of the book, I mean, in consonance with what Joel says about the limitations of design, is often institutions that have actually quite autonomous on paper, actually don't exercise that autonomous power as much. And sometimes institutions whose formal design doesn't seem to protect them as much, actually leadership can help. But I think the critical reason is not that, right? I think the critical thing you have to think about, and I think the CAG is a good example, right, is how is the institution embedded in a chain of other institutions that allows you to pass a judgment that what is really going on is a chain of accountability. I think what happened with the CAG, right? I mean, I think in principle there was no problem with raising the profile of the CAG. Suddenly people actually even discovered that this institution existed, as opposed to Devesh being the only person who read 30 years of CAG reports. In one paper he wrote The Myth of the Sisyphean State, right? But where was the breakdown, right? In our constitutional scheme, actually, Parliament needed to have taken a call after the CAG had spoken. In fact, I was and I still remain opposed to the Lokpal as an institution. I think it's a terrible idea. Right? It's a terrible idea because you actually already have a mechanism at hand, which is a parliamentary committee. A parliamentary committee, as the final locus of accountability, should be able to sift through which CAG reports you accept and which you reject, and should be able to explain that through public reason, right? Because you don't want to be in a position where the CAG has veto over everything. I mean, that's a complete disaster, right? So I think when you talk about, in a sense, that institutional story, you have to ask whether that circle of accountability and whether each chain in that mechanism is actually complete. Almost all the solutions people have been proposing have been premised on the idea that you cannot complete that chain. So what you need is some overpowering individual or institution to, in a sense, act as a substitute or surrogate.
I don't know if Joel or Mithra, you want to take the issue of the regional question, which is, as a region, South Asia is generally under-institutionalized when it comes to cross-border organizations. Is that something that should be a priority for India? And if any of you want to tackle that.
I would say a priority for what? I mean, if it's regional organizations to deal with regional disputes and how to handle interactions across neighbors, that's one thing. And indeed, South Asia is the least regionally institutionalized. And one could argue that there's could be very powerful and important impacts if there was ever a way to come to regional agreements. But I think that's very, very far off indeed. When the OAS model you gave is the extent to which the regional a regional organization can use the collective power in some way as a mechanism to impact internal politics of member countries. by using the collective power as somehow as a constraint or disciplining mechanism, as OAS is trying to do now in Venezuela and others. And in that respect, I don't see much that you would achieve in South Asia and certainly in the Indian context. I think, to me, and it kind of goes back to the original subtext of the discussion, I'm fascinated by India playing a stronger role in multilateral institutions, in bringing its voice and its experience, and because of the high capacity at the upper levels across bureaucracies, therefore the ability to engage at the highest levels within multilateral institutions is strong. The potential is there. I think India's role in multilateral institutions is one in which would be able to help us understand better the Indian experience and its applicability that we learned from it elsewhere, which is what brought me to read the book in the first place. So I think I'm more interested in seeing in the existing panoply of multilateral institutions, how does India bring its voice and its story more strongly into those institutions? Regional institutions for dealing with cross-border issues is again an entirely different matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many, many reasons why there needs to be regional integration. But will it have an impact on institutions? I don't necessarily think that's the way to go, and I don't necessarily think that India being held up as an example of institutions having done better than others is a plausible narrative at all. So I think there are many reasons for regional integration, but not to put pressure on one or other institution to.
Let's just take maybe one final lightning round, and then we'll Sasha in the back. Yeah.
Thanks, Milind. It's Sasha Reiser-Koziski from Eurasia Group. We all know that the Indian state is desperately understaffed, right? There's not enough police, there's the judiciary, there's not enough judges, there's not enough pharmaceutical inspectors, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And as you already noted, as Devesh noted, it's hard to see the government ponying up and being willing to strengthen these institutions, in part because it could act on a check on their power. But I was wondering, in what areas do you see the state going forward actually working and putting the money to strengthen that capacity and increase the number of people required?
Great, good question. There was one, on the aisle there, Aditya.
My name is Aditya. I'm a graduate student at George Washington.
Speak up a little, sorry.
My name is Aditya. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. My question is kind of like following up on Sasha's question, which is, are all institutions going to be treated equally? Are some institutions more important than others? In some fieldwork in Bihar that I did, people often talk about how sort of like the bureaucracy or this discretionary use by the civil service actually kind of undoes much of the work that politicians do. So kind of like some institutions actually eat up on the space by others. So in that sense, if one has to go about strengthening some institutions, does one strengthen someone's more than the others, or like is this like a zero-sum game, so to speak, or can one strengthen all institutions at the same time?
So let's, just in the interest of ending roughly around time, why don't we just take those and whoever wants to opine. I mean, the first question is, they're sort of related, right? I mean, one is about if you had to sort of guess where this government would invest, what are the various areas? The second is there a sort of zero-sum aspect that if you spend all of your chits on one, then somebody else gets left behind? I don't know, Pratap, if you want to start.
I think two quick points. So one, of course, building institutions is a process and a very sort of complicated interactive process. So sometimes institutions are indirect products of something you did elsewhere in society for completely extraneous reasons, right? So one of the things, for example, I mean, you might, for populist reasons, want to actually increase your taxation capabilities. But if you increase your taxation capabilities, it might actually allow you more play in terms of investment in institutions. And I think right now the optimistic part of the story is this kind of what you might call techno-fiscalism, right? That you sort of have some kind of technology and greater fiscal efficiency on the taxation side that should give the state a lot of headroom to improve. I think you know, and the Modi government's big achievements are largely in that area, with all, you know, with some dangers kind of I think attached to it. But if you look at the institutions in a slightly different way, right, not just as sort of these kind of raw capacities, the institution's ability, you know, which is what institutions largely are, to sort of channelize and mediate conflict, right? There, I think it is actually, I think, an open question. I think one of the big surprises to everybody in the Modi government is that you would have expected more and more intelligent investment in the basic sovereign functions of the state, right? Police, security, paramilitary, right? If you do it right. Actually, arguably even more neglected than they were, and it's showing up in our ability to mediate conflict. I mean, it's not just, many of those conflicts are not just law and order problems, right? But surely the instrumentalities of the state at your disposal, CRPF is, I think, a perfectly good example, right? Surprisingly, you're actually not finding any break with that historical pattern of sort of letting the military and paramilitary do some stuff relatively cheaply, right? Without thinking of what organizational changes are required to make law and order strong functions.
Well, I have no answer to the question. I actually, to me, I'm consistently struck by the puzzle. Why understaff systematically in India? I mean, the political imperative to overstaff is so strong in so many other places of the world, especially those with democratic competition, especially those with a decentralized structure of government. It's like, tell me the magic that leads to understand. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that I don't think that the understaffing is not a significant problem, but it is a political puzzle. In a country in which you would use public sector employment for patronage reasons, if you would use it, for kind of political sort of support network building, I don't understand why systematically you'd understaff across so many institutions.
So the staffing, I mean, I think that it's a little bit damned if you do and damned if you don't. There was this in the early 80s, the IAS, the cadre strength of the IAS, which means basically the number of IAS officers, there was this big hullabaloo about the fact that there were just too many IAS officers, and states were really pushing back. No, states were not pushing back. The Ministry of Home Affairs was pushing back, saying that you need to reduce your intake of IAS officers. So then there was a very dramatic reduction somewhere around the 90s, a very dramatic reduction of intake into the IAS. But there was, interestingly, a commensurate, and I don't know the numbers on this, but there was a commensurate increase in, well, not commensurate, but an increase in the strength of the state civil service. And there was basically states tended to staff up, whereas the central government tended to staff down. And that, in a sense, plays to some of the political issues that you raised, Joel. I just wonder if so I think that yes, it is understaffed, but I also think that the understaffing probably exists more at the central level than it does at the state and local level, except for certain categories. So you will find that at the local level, you're unable to find people that reside in, doctors that live in rural areas, or people from scheduled tribes that the vacancies are notorious among scheduled tribes. So you're just not able to fill those seats. So part of the reason for these large number of vacancies is that you're not able to, for whatever reason, find scheduled tribe, not scheduled caste, scheduled tribe candidates for certain types of jobs. Now, whether or not you're looking, whether or not your pool is the way it is, whether or not you're advertising in the right places is a separate issue. But that, to a large extent, not to a large extent, but that to an extent explains the level of vacancies at the local level. At the central level, I just think that there was a concerted decision to trim down, and people are just scared of what would happen if they started to staff back up.
Vesh, you apparently had the last word in the book, and now you have the last word on stage.
So here's some basic facts. So between 1990 and about 2015, absolute size of the Indian state dropped by about 10%. This includes central, state, and local government officials. The same period, India's population increased by about 365 million, which is more than the population of the United States. However, these numbers mask a shift in the structure of staffing. Now find, and this happened after a book, that about 40% of government staff at the central government is contract labor. So there's a big shift in the underlying dynamics of, and this is also happening in states where many of the teachers are contracted teachers. So and we know that labor markets worldwide, the nature of employment contracts has been changing enormously. In the World Bank, it's been changing. And so this is also reflected. So part of this thing is that this number, there are various ways if you're not sure whether it includes contracts, some report, some don't, etc. The second is that one of the biggest puzzles at the state level is very low, very high rates of vacancies in the police. Every politician you might think wants to pack, at least with police, and just the beat guy. Very high rates of vacancy. Now, one thing is that there's another government mechanism in India called the pay commission, which is something of a rarity in India. So every periodically they come up with pay rises, which cascades to the entire system, and that puts very large fiscal pressures at a time when the governments, because of other political pressures, have been sharply increasing social welfare programs, at least expenditures. And at the same time, because the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act have been trying to put a ceiling on government expenditures. Actually, interesting, related to Pratap's point, which is, defense expenditure, for instance, now. Normally you expect right-wing governments, security conscious. Defense expenditure as a fraction of GDP is almost at a 50-year low. It is incredible that you would expect the contrary, but actually it's the opposite. The single biggest increase in hiring of personnel of the central government has been paramilitary forces. In personnel, not necessarily, as Pratap said, in equipment and I think two things why the Indian system's checks and balances, which drive people off in nuts, that the procedures actually make it a very protracted process to hire people. It's not that easy. First, you have all these reservations, which means that the candidate must come from these groups. So if you don't have from these groups, then it takes a lot of time that it can spill over to a general hiring. That just takes a long time. Then, so what you begin to see is that there have been some creative things, and this is what leads essentially to outsourcing. Contract labor is a form of outsourcing. Much more private contracts, like for different things, are being done. So the personnel processes, in fact, if there's one part of the thing that again we didn't have, but and we talked about the UPSC, it's the very strength of the system, which is very procedure laden, also means it's very hard to pack and bring your folks in, at least in large numbers.
So I think we'll formally end the conversation here, and again, hope that you all can join us downstairs for refreshments. And the book is on sale. I'll just mention as an aside that there's a great arbitrage opportunity to buy this book now rather than online. I want to thank Maitri and Joel for lending their perspectives, and of course thank all of you for coming, and thank Devesh and Pratap, who has come literally across the ocean to be with us today. So thank you all.
All right. Oh, okay. I heard about it.